Origin stories, origin stories. Where did we come from? How did we get here? These are the stories that made us the heroes that we are today. Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and welcome back to episode 3 of Origin Stories. I'm very excited to share this with you today. I've got a very special guest, MDG, Marty Golia, who has obviously a long history as a comic book reader and a comic book collector and fan, but he's also done some work professionally in comics, writing or co-writing X-O Manowar for a while. So he's got a different viewpoint than any of my other guests. He is into a lot of things that I'm unfamiliar with. So it was really exciting to talk to him about his reading and collecting history and to learn his origin story. So I hope you enjoy watching this as much as I enjoyed filming it. And I want to thank my guest, MDG, for joining me, and let's jump right into it. All right, well, thanks very much for joining me. I appreciate it. I don't know whether I should call you Marty or MDG. I don't know if you...
Marty.
Marty, okay. So welcome to the next episode of Origin Stories. I'm here with Marty, and we're going to hear his origin story as a comic collector with the 10 issues that shape your journey. I'm really excited to hear about this. Of course, I had you on the podcast before, so we've talked some about your history in comics, but I'm really looking forward to sort of, I really enjoy the more personal, experience of getting to know how a collector got to the point they're at now. So I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, great.
And we could just jump right in if you want to start with your first book.
Yeah, well, it's one of the first books I have, and this is not the copy of it. I bought it later on, but it's Batman 181, first Poison Ivy, and I kind of remember getting like 3 or 5 Batman comics from my uncle, when I was probably 6 or 7, and this was one of them, and it just kind of started me out. I think one of the first things I remember was this splash page where they're kind of like at a art exhibit or a pop art exhibit. That shows that, and had this great pinup.
The pinup is missing.
In the center page. In the center spread. And, it's just started me out. I don't remember if this was right around the time the TV show came on or just before it. But, I started out as a, just Batman and Superman fan, because I used to watch the Superman TV show with my uncle. And it was just, getting into that at that point, where, Batman and Superman had just kind of loomed large, like Frankenstein and Dracula,
right,
at that time. And, I would just, so I just started reading those, but I would get books and just kind of like read them to death, So, and this was, again, one of the first ones I really remember. Soon after that, I started buying stuff off the racks, and this one actually is my copy that I bought. This is JLA 47. It is not in the best shape at all. But it's part 2 of maybe the second or third JLA JSA team up.
Right.
So this kind of introduced me to, I knew Superman and Batman, and I'd seen ads for Green Lanterns or some of the other characters, but Dr. Fate, Dr. Midnight, I'm not sure what, wasn't sure what those were, where they came out of. And Spectre's in here too, which I did know from again, the same uncle had given me a copy of Jules Pfeiffer's The Great Comic Book Heroes.
Okay.
That had a Spectre story in it. And again, this is at the time, Go-Go Chuck's Batman front and center. And even though it was the second part of a two-parter, I was just, right into it. There was enough explanation to say, okay, there's this antimatter man, and the Spectre is between Earth 1 and Earth 2 and pushing them apart. And all the Justice Society and Justice League have to get the antimatter man out of there. And again, separate Earth 1 and Earth 2. So, I mean, it's just a lot of ideas.
Yeah.
Kicking around and a lot of characters. But, just kind of opened up to the larger, I don't want to say B-list heroes, but, if you weren't Superman or Batman, to me, you were a B-list hero. And just what was going on with that. And, Sikowski and Green, one of my favorite art teams on there. So I don't know why I still have this book, because obviously the other comics I had around that time, I don't consciously recall getting rid of them or my mom getting rid of them. But just as it's a mystery how those disappeared, it's a mystery why this one.
Yeah, I've got books like that from my early days. The New Mutants Summer Special from 1985 was a year after I started, and for some reason I have my original copy, and the cover's detached. Like, I used to read it over and over, but all the other, most of the other comics I got at that time, I don't know what happened to them. Like, I have replacements for them. One thing I'm curious to ask you about is when I talked with Roquefort Raider in the last episode, we talked about the experience of new readers now versus when we were younger. And it just strikes me like when you were reading this, you're getting introduced to these new heroes, and you had, the book that had introduced you to Spectre. But with people now, like if you're a kid now, you read about it, you can just go online and there's like the entire publishing history of these characters. And I'm not sure if that's better, a better experience now. I feel like the experience of discovery that we had is not something they can really have any longer.
Yeah, and I think it's. What year did you start reading comics?
The 84.
Okay, so I'm already in for close to 20 years at that point, and I could not understand, like in the 90s though, how people were even exposed to comics, because I would go down to there was like a local candy store, toy shop on the corner that had a spinner rack, and a couple other places, other stationery stores. So I would see them all over, and again, I had an uncle who kind of introduced me to a few things, but it was just like always around. And, and again, the Batman TV show just kind of raised awareness all of a sudden. So there were like, magazine articles and newspaper articles, but you just like find things, and, you kind of get what you can from house ads and, letter column. The thing is, I was never like a very steady reader of anything. So I started out, reading DCs, and I always bought like, Superman, Justice League, Batman were kind of like my favorites, but I was just as likely to buy Dell Ghost Stories, or, I was like more of a monster kid. So it was like Gold Key, Ripley's Believe It or Not, True Weird, and True Ghost Stories. Obviously the Warren books. Then I think I was in 4th grade. A kid lent me an issue of Mad, which my cousin had read, but my mother was not happy about it. So I, didn't ask about it. But, like I said, a friend lent me a copy, and I was around 67 or so. He lent me the one that had the first Star Trek parody in it. So that'll, kind of give you the date. And then I kind of had a run of that going through the mid 70s.
Just it's
Also,
such a different. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, go ahead. You go.
I was just gonna say it's such a different experience because I remember, and this was quite a bit later, but I remember in 84, 85, being a kid, and we still had the spinner racks at a few places. I encountered comics from a spinner rack at a drugstore.
Mhm.
That's a story that like you could have had from any time period up until the 90s, and now it's completely gone. We used to go to Walden Books, and they'd have a spinner rack there, and so we go to the bookstore. That's how I got my comics for the first like 2 years, was spinner racks.
Yeah.
Before I really could go to a comic book store. But I remember Mad. Like it's interesting you mentioned that, because I have these memories of summer vacation and going to the Five and Dime on the corner and getting the new Mad or the new Cracked and reading it with my friends and stuff. It's just interesting. It's almost like there's a certain timelessness to that experience that's just sort of like pre-internet, post-internet, totally different worlds. And so even though I was in the 80s and you were in the 60s, it wasn't that different. And we're both like, compared to what happens now, it's just I don't really understand how kids now would really encounter comics other than through the movies, I guess.
Yeah, well, even more than that, it was pre-comic shop, post-comic shop. Because I'm trying to think what the first comic book store I saw was. And there was one in Nyack, New York, that I went to a couple times. I'm trying to think, I really can't remember what was the first one that says, this is a comic book store, this is what we do. It would be magazine stores or used bookstores that might have a section that grew and took over. But again, that was early mid 70s.
Yeah.
Also I was very much would go to the library and get collections, because around this time Nostalgia Press was coming out, so there were collections like Dick Tracy and Crazy Cat, and you started getting some of the histories started to come out. Nothing like now. I mean, you could probably fill 2 feet of shelf space with every book on comics that was available at the time, unlike now. So I was interested in like older strips and things that were going on. So and one of the big ones was Les Daniels' book, Comics, The History of Comics in America. And that and other things led me to my number 3, which is R. Crumb's Head Comics. And, again, this was, I think, this is 72 printing, so I was about 13. And even though I don't know if technically I could or couldn't buy this legally, I obviously did. And, you said a Walden's books. It might have been in a Walden book, or there was a local one called Aldine's Books in White Plains or Brentano's, but I picked it up, just at a mass market, mass market comic book. And, I'd seen Keep on Truckin' and, the T-shirts, and obviously the Big Brother and the Holding Company album cover by Crumb, and there were things kind of all over, but I'd never seen an actual underground or like full stories. And of course, this isn't nearly as deep, and not necessarily his best work. There's a long Fritz story in here, but this was just a huge influence on me. And there's like somewhere in here there's like a ink thumb stain thumbprint of mine, because I would just like copy drawings out of here. And so I started reading Underground and National Lampoon, and still kind of staying with Warrens and Mads and things like that. But I also started hearing about EC, because EC had been gone 15, close to 20 years at this point. no comic book stores. I hadn't started going to comic shows yet, or conventions as they were. But, you know, and again, the Les Daniels book and other things I'd heard, you know, just kind of read about this comic book line that was, you know, this terribly horror, you know, just totally objectionable horror books, but, you know, mad remains from this whole line. And the big Nostalgia Press book came out around this time. I hadn't gotten that yet, but there was kind of a convergence where I had seen ads for the Nostalgia Press book in a Lampoon. That Lampoon had a story based on George Wallace that was basically an EC pastiche. And around that same time, I picked up a Warren issue of Creepy. And of course, you know, the Warrens were a third ads. And one of the ads was for the first attempt to start reprinting ECs in some kind of systematic form. This was a thing called East Coast Comics. It was a buck. And their first issue was the last issue of Tales from the Crypt, which when EC folded, they actually had been planning to do a fourth horror title called The Crypt of Terror. But, you know, that just went out as the last issue of Tales from the Crypt. So this was like, except for like the couple stories in the Les Daniels book, the first time I saw like an EC story and actually, you know, was able to read, you know, the 4 issues or the 4 stories in an issue. And I think I was like 13, 14 at this time. And, you know, again, I read this to death. It was just, oh my God, EC, EC, EC. It's all I would think about.
So I'm curious, what was drawing you to first the underground comics and also the EC? Just wondering, like, how. Imagine, you know, I had a very different experience because I was really starting in the mid 80s, and so with the independent comics, and, you know, we get Watchmen and The Dark Knight, all this stuff. But I feel like at the time you were reading, the Comics Code restrictions on mainstream comics much more effect. So I'm guessing seeing these comics had a very different sort of impact on you than when I go to the store, and it was just sort of another sort of thing on the stands.
Yeah, I mean, you know, because of the way comics were with, you know, with the code, but, you know, comics were just so staid and, you know, squeaky clean. So it was either, you know, Superman. I, you know, probably only read 4 Marvels maybe, you know, during the, you know, till I was like in my 20s. And if I picked up a Marvel, it meant there were no DCs on the spinner rack, you know, wherever I was on vacation or something. But just the idea that something would be overtly violent or, you know, have, like in some of these EC stories, these really dark stories about, you know, men and women and couples and, you know, killing each other and jealousy. And there was one, you know, there's one in here drawn by Joe Orlando about a guy who's just like, he's married to his woman and his in-laws live with him, and they keep telling him he's got to get ahead and nothing he could do, you know, to, you know, he's not successful at anything, and you got to get ahead and you got to get ahead. And he kind of telegraphs what happens at the end of that. Yeah, it was just so different than, you know, what was out there. And, you know, just like with the new music at the time, just knowing that these undergrounds were out there and there's things going on, it just kind of attracted me to it. So around this time, 74, 75, 76, is when in New York City you started to get some of the big comic shows, and a big comic show at that time might draw 2,000, 3,000 people. And, you know, I'd go to one and Joe Simon and Jack Kirby and, you know, all these people would be there. But I would like make a beeline to like Bobby London and Sherry Flanagan and Dennis Kitchen, you know, some of the people from the underground who were there. And, you know, I started collecting like sketches and things like that. And also I could buy some undergrounds there because obviously they were not in stores or,
Right.
no drugstores or pharmacies or stationery stores where I lived. And of course they had ads in the back for, the different dealers. And the main one being that I used was Crumb Comic Works, which was a division of Kitchen Sink, Dennis Kitchen's company. And, I'd get a catalog, and it would be, a 36-page catalog. It'd be like 12 pages of comics and 12 pages of drug paraphernalia and, 12 pages of Carlos Castaneda paperbacks and T-shirts and things like that. And I would mail order it. And, you had to sign this thing that says I am legal of age to, I'm over 18. And, of course I wasn't, and it was like really nerve-wracking just signing that little coupon. But, putting an order in and going to the post office and getting a mail order to send away and, picking up, then getting a package of like 12 at a time. And it was just great. I would just devour that. So of the undergrounds, I just put this one out, one of my favorites, which is Skull number 6.
Okay.
This, Skull again was a horror anthology, and I gravitated more toward things like Skull and Slow Death and some of the other horror adventure undergrounds more so than even like Zap or Bijou, the, funny ones. But this had a Richard Corbin, it was half Greg Irons and half Richard Corbin. It's like a two-part story. Later reading, it's very Lovecraftian. And again, the other thing that got me into undergrounds was the creepy that had the ad for the EC reprint also had what I think was Corbin's first story for Warren, or one of them. And I just went crazy over Corbin's work. So, he would be in creepy and eerie, but everything else was Fantagor, Grimwit, or, just other underground. So
Right.
that was the thing that drove me toward that.
I find this all really interesting because it's so outside of my experience. Like, I've seen Skull, like I know what it is, but I've never read it. And it's the same with a lot of the undergrounds. It's just, by the time I was collecting, like I mentioned, undergrounds weren't, there was the independent comics you could get at the comic stores. And I think some of those people had sort of moved into that space. But it was almost like I kind of heard that it had existed, but I never really saw it or experienced it. And now, it's like the few that I've read, like I have a later printing of Zap Zero and a couple things like that. And I read them, in the 90s or early 2000s, and I just sort of like didn't understand what I was looking at. And I feel like there's a whole thing that I just can't plug into, that I just like, I needed to be there to get it.
Yeah, and when I talk about undergrounds, probably it's really only from like 67 to maybe 74, 75, where you really had that kind of boom and bust of, the San Francisco artists and, head shops where, there's the distribution and, some things in like alternative weeklies. And then again, around that time is when the comic shops start popping up. So there's more of an outlet for stuff that's, it's not really as underground as it was. It's, more just another ground level, comics. So the independents that came out like, Saber and, things like that. But yeah, my initial ambition as a cartoonist was to be published in an underground before I was legally able to buy them, which didn't happen, but not for lack of trying. And part of that was when I was visiting my grandmother in Dearborn, Michigan. There was a great newsstand, magazine shop near where she lived, and that's where I had gotten, I'd go there and I'd get mad and creepy and eerie and cracked or something like that. But then I was there one year, and then in that little part where you have to go through the little like half door to get to because it's adult things, I saw this on the stand, Arcade, the Comics Review, which was edited by Bill Griffith and Art Spiegelman. And it was an attempt to come up with a more slick, easily available package, with many of the, the main underground cartoonists. And I think the first two issues were there right next to each other. So I picked those up right away and got a subscription to it. But this was, there's people like Crumb and Spiegelman doing his more experimental stuff before he did Mouse, where it's a lot more about the form of comics. Gilbert Shelton, it's just like everybody kind of at the top of their game. And the people who were doing the best work here, like there's a really good Zippy story in here by Bill Griffith. And Bill Griffith is still doing really good stuff, not just the Zippy strip, but Invisible Ink, the story he did about his mother. And he did a graphic biography of Schlitzie the Pinhead. And he's still putting out great stuff. And this was again just a big influence on me. And they had a thing where they were looking for submissions, so I tried to submit a couple things there that were pretty damn crude, and got a nice rejection note, a nice handwritten rejection note from Bill Griffith.
Yeah, when I was again, I feel like I missed this whole thing, and by the time I was aware of comics, I knew Bill Griffith from Zippy the Pinhead in the comics page of my newspaper, and because it was so weird compared to everything else that every day I would read the comic strip, like for breakfast. I'd read the comics page, and I'd read Zippy the Pinhead, and half of the days I'd find it incredibly funny. And the other half of the days I'd just sit there looking at it like, I'm missing something here. I know this is funny to someone, but don't understand the context. But I feel like I find this all fascinating. Just this window into this whole, scene that almost, it feels to me like it's, I don't want to say it's vanished, because I get a slight hint of the vibe. Like I go to, now that I'm self-publishing my own comic, I go to like the Masters Independent Comics Expo, which is it's only people that make their own comics. And I get some of that feel, I think, there, but otherwise it's like a vanished world to me. I don't know.
Well, yeah, there's just a lot more out now. And, I'm only now getting back into it, because now you see comic shops opening that don't have Marvel or DC, or that's not 90% of the business. It's more like these alternative things coming out in different formats. And, again, I still, I'm still not buying a ton of stuff. It takes a lot for me to make that commitment. And again, the quality just varies widely and stuff. But, but it's interesting. There's a lot of people doing stuff out there. The whole area of autobiographical comics is like, all over. And again, one of the things I almost pulled here was American Splendor #1. by Harvey Picar.
That's like about the only one that I have read much of. I have a few issues of American Splendor, and I keep wanting to like get the rest of them. Yeah, there's like I have several different things in my head I want to talk to you about, because like I found your experience there reminded me when I was a kid, when I was 13, I think, which was in 1986, and I had read this, like Jim Shooter had written this big thing for the Price Guide about his experiences. Of course, he started writing for DC when he was 13.
Yeah.
So, like, wow, you can do that? So I started submitting stories to Marvel when I was 13, and I'd get these rejection letters like, thanks for your dumb story, and I was sure that if I did, like, I was like, this is great. It's, Rom meets Iron Man and they fight the Human Torch. Why aren't they buying this?
Yeah. Well, it's
what you were doing was a little bit better than my idea. But
well, you're only seeing a piece of it here, because while I wasn't buying, a lot of mainstream comics, I was picking up like fanzines, besides like the Buyer's Guide and the Comic Reader, that were like kind of the news zines, but things like Comics Crusader, where they'd have interviews with contemporary and older artists, like Joe Staton, next to an interview with Jack Bender or something like that. Of course, around this time, early mid 70s, Warren came out with The Spirit, which was again another influential, or just something that did not look like what was out there. Also at this time, even though I had somehow missed the entire run of Swamp Thing, I became a huge Bernie Wrightson fan. And he, after he left Swamp Thing, was doing a lot of work for Warren. Just wonderful stuff, and his Color of the Creature book, and I picked up things like Kaluda's Shadow, again usually at a store, or some kind of back issue thing, very little off the stands. I knew about like the Neil Adams stuff and Stranko, but it just didn't connect with me like other stuff. And it wasn't until I went to college, a guy I hadn't known, but we met through the Campus Humor magazine. He came up to my dorm room, and he goes, is that a Mike Kaluta drawing on your wall? I said, yeah. And we just like started talking for hours, and we became we're still very close friends. But he just had a huge collection of comics, and we just started talking to him, and another friend that I met in college. I started going back to my Silver Age roots, because there was a comic shop in Syracuse that we would go to, and pick up the new stuff, but then they had a bunch of boxes of 60s and early 70s DCs and Marvel, everything with a colored price sticker, and for things like Hawkman and kind of again the B tier DC heroes, it was like 75 cents an issue, for the 60s one. And I just started, I'd pick up 4 new books and 4 old books, and just started kind of building that up again, because I never had an appreciation of a lot of that Silver Age mainstream art. I remember one time, one Sunday morning, we would get the Sunday newspaper in the dining hall, and there was Parade magazine that Gannett used to put out, which was like their Sunday magazine. And one time it had a Superman cover on it. And, my 2 friends are there, and they go, oh, look, it's a Kurtzman Superman. And I go, yeah. And the guy goes, yeah, with Vinnie Coletta inking. And I'm looking at them, goes, how can you tell that? All the superhero art, it just all looks totally the same to me. And, that's when I started really being able to pick up, you know, Swan, Infantino, and Anderson, and Kubert, and just being able to pick out their stylistic differences, and just really building up, again, a nice Silver Age DC reader copy collection that, you know, I still love, you know, and just kind of going back and rereading that.
Yeah, that's great. So book number 6.
All right, this is the one that's probably going to go out of publishing order. Again, when I was in college, I was at a small show and spotted this Harvey Kurtzman's Jungle Book.
Oh, okay.
You know, coming out of Underground, who all idolized Kurtzman, and of course EC and Mad. I was, you know, very interested in Kurtzman, but you know, it was hard to find his stuff back then. I mean, there was Annie Fanny, and there was the Mad paperbacks that had his the ones he edited in there. But this is, you know, a book length paperback original done for an adult audience. And, you know, it's just probably my favorite piece by him. I've got again, Kitchen Sink put out a reprint of it, larger size, mostly from the original art. And it's, you know, I just, you know, love his style. It's just like, I don't know how much you can tell here, but, you know, very expressionistic, and just has a lot of movement and life, and his observations on, you know, TV and media, and you know, and just the way he would set up jokes. It's just great. You know, Kurtzman's, you know, probably, you know, one of my favorite creators ever. And again, Dennis Kitchen, being a huge fan of his, you know, put out Jungle Book, and then his Hey Look, a collection of those strips that he had done for Timely in the 40s, and Humbug and Trump. And it's just, you know, all this material that's like Mad, but again, he was trying to get a little more sophisticated for a different audience. Sometimes successful, usually artistically successful, usually not very successful commercially, but again, it's just, you know, some of my favorite stuff ever.
That's interesting. Like, I've not heard of this. I mean, I know who Harvey Kurtzman is, but Jungle Book, I've not heard of this. And, you know, last episode, Roquefort Raider had a couple things that I was pretty iffy on because they were from France. But this is the first one where I, like, legitimately have just not heard of that. So I'm really interested. I'll have to look into that one.
Yeah, I'm trying to think when it was originally published. Okay, 1959. And I think it only went through like one printing. Again, Valentine was pretty lucky with the Mad paperback reprints, which, again, that was something else where during the 60s, you could go into a bookstore or a stationery store and see a paperback spinner rack that would have half a dozen, you know, Mad paperbacks in there. And also Valentine put out about 4 or 6 versions like the Mad paperbacks, but of the EC horror and science fiction books. 2 of them were anchored by the fact that they were all Ray Bradbury stories. But I guess those didn't sell like Mad, because again, they only did about half a dozen of them. And I think they only went through 1 or 2 printings each. Whereas, you know, the Mad paperbacks were constantly in print as I was growing up. So, you know, this would bring us up to about the early 80s. And I was kind of getting back more into mainstream comics, not too much. I mean, there was also the independents like First Comics and Eclipse, were coming out, and I was picking up things like American Flag and Zot and Johnny Quest. And I don't have my copy here, but the one DC book that was a real influencer that really impressed me was Ambush Bug #1.
No, I might actually have a copy here. Hold on.
Okay.
It just occurred to me. I think I actually have this. I hope I'm right. Where is it? I thought I had it in this box right next to me.
Okay.
I have a copy of Ambush Bug 1 that has a date stamp on it, because I remember being like, that's unusual for a comic that late to still have a date stamp on the cover. I'm sorry. Yeah. Huge disappointment. I thought I was going to pull it out. Sorry, I didn't interrupt.
You can cut it in later. You can find it.
All right. Okay.
We'll just cut it in. But yeah, because one of the things about the mainstream books is they were like kid stuff, and then started taking themselves seriously, then kind of overshot it. Now we're taking ourselves really seriously. And Giffen was like the only person out there, it seemed like, who was saying, well, a lot of this is pretty silly. And it was just like, let's look at this, from a, different angle. And I loved the art style he started to adopt around the time of Ambush Bug, where I know, people give him a little grief that it was very much based on it's Jorge Munoz style, a South American artist. And, it definitely is, but it was just like really nicely done. And, I would also started reading the Legion for the first time because of his artwork in there. It was just really appealing to me, and he had good luck with his inkers then. It was like Schaffenberger and Carl Kiesel and Larry Malstedt, and it just really worked together very well. But Ambush Bug was a Son of Ambush Bug, with a couple of specials. I just really enjoyed those, and as well as things like he did Legion of Substitute Heroes. There was a special, and then an issue of DC Presents with the subs in it that was just really nicely done. And I think he was working with Paul Levitz on some of those, or Robert Lauren Fleming. It just, made a nice, a good team.
Yeah, I think I mentioned before we were on the air, whatever that means, that Ambush Bug was very early, one of the early series that I started reading. The first issue happened to come out just a few months after I really started reading comics. And so it introduced me to a bunch of stuff like Johnny DC, but also I loved it. Like Cheeks the Toy Wonder, I thought was hilarious. Yeah, and for people who haven't read Ambush Bug, it's something you should read, particularly because to me, Deadpool is just Ambush Bug, but not as funny. Like, I think Ambush Bug is basically, has got everything that Deadpool has got, except for is sort of funnier. I feel like, I know that stylistically, when they created Deadpool, they ripped off the way he looked from Death Master Terminator.
Yeah.
Personality wise, they clearly, it's Ambush Bug the whole way.
Yeah, well, I think it was the third issue of the Ambush Bug series, where it was just like half-page things where it's looking at, silly or outdated concepts. So it would be, like Egg Foo, Ace the Bad Hound, and they had Julie Schwartz, who was the editor, of that book. But yeah, I just thought that was hilarious and really nicely done. Again, I was kind of keeping track of what DC was doing, because they were doing Who's Who at that time, the first one, and of course Crisis, which I have a friend who has, I think, 4 different editions of Crisis, and he just loves it. But I remember going through it, and I was talking to a friend again. I think they're just going to get rid of everything except Earth 1 and Earth 2. And then an issue later, I said, I think they're going to get rid of Earth 2 too. I said, oh shit,
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
Crisis on Infinite Earths for me, like I was just starting comics, and I was so confused when all of a sudden, from one month to the next, the continuity just changed in all the titles because I wasn't reading Crisis, I was reading Superman, and then it was just like all of a sudden it ends and then he comes back, but he doesn't remember anything that I was just reading. And I gave up on DC superheroes for like 20 years. Well, actually forever, because I just didn't understand what was happening. It was supposed to make things simpler, but it was so confusing.
Well, yeah, and just getting rid of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman in the Golden Age, it just, I don't know, it just does not seem right.
And since then, of course, I've gone back and I have the collected edition. I've read
Yeah.
Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it's even more confusing when you read it than it is if you haven't read it. So it's just because it's like the story ends and then it's like, oh, but there's a new Earth that's been created, and then they're trying to figure out where they are, and then the story ends again. But then it's like, nope, he comes back like a third time, and I'm like,
yeah,
oh,
that's
like
where,
just this is crazy.
yeah, that's what kind of turned me off of that kind of stuff. It just became like universe maintenance instead of storytelling, and it's
Yeah.
But the 80s is probably when I was heaviest into at least buying new stuff off the stands. But again, it was again, First Comics and Pacific and Eclipse, Mystery and Journey. There's just a lot of stuff, interesting stuff out there, as opposed to the 90s where things like Malibu and some of the other companies came out where it's like, okay, we're going to do what Marvel and DC do. It was just like, we're going to launch our own universe instead of, let's just get some creators to do projects they like to do and see how they go. Which brings to the number 9, I believe, which was Mechanics. I had seen Love and Rocket on the stands, and Fantagraphics had done a big presentation at a convention I was at, but leafing through it, it just didn't appeal to me. And I think I was hitting all the Mario and Beto pages where the artwork was kind of crude. But when they put out a color version of Jamie's earliest stories, and I mean, the artwork is just so beautiful. It's just simple and graphic and naturalistic, and it just, kills me even then how, like, first time out of the box, and since then going back and looking at Gilbert's stuff, how the brothers were just able to just be up here, automatically, from the first time out. It's not like, it felt like they were floundering around. It's just amazing stuff. And I just read, I guess, Frogmouth, which came out a few years ago. I think it's called Frogmouth, something like that. One of Jamie's collections. And it's just, the way the characters have aged, but things go back and forth, and just the stories, and just seeing these characters grow up. They're all in their 50s now. I don't know if they've ever reconciled why early on they were riding hover cycles and seeing dinosaurs, but it really doesn't matter because it's just just so well done.
It's again another blind spot. I have a couple collections of theirs. I'm looking at them right now. I can see them. They're taunting me. I've got one that's called Angels and Magpies, and I won it in a contest, and it's signed by one of the brothers. And I haven't read it through it. I've opened it a few times, and it almost feels a little intimidating to try and jump in. I just can't seem to find the right entry point for me, but it's something I keep meaning to, because from looking at the art, I know that I'm going to like the art quite a bit. It reminds me of sort of a more mature, I don't want to say adult, but a more mature sort of like Archie, like Dan DiCarlo. There's a certain clean style that I really respond to. I'm just having trouble figuring out where to start, like story wise.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm sure there's probably checklists and lists of, you know, how everything lays out chronologically, or, you know, and it might say what the best, you know, way to get in. I think if you could find a collection of just the earliest ones, you know, after, you know, this was a 3-issue, I was able to at least pick up for cover price or near it, I think from like issue 7 on, through their first iteration. Kind of got out of it in the 90s, but getting back in and picking up some of the collections. But yeah, it's interesting what you say about the Carla, because it's very realistically drawn, but very, you know, like Alex Toth, very simple, very graphic. But then, you know, Maggie gets mad and, you know, smoke comes out and, you know, her teeth are just a, you know, big zigzag. And it, you know, but it just fits because it's cartoons, it's, you know, it's comics, and it just, you know, works that way.
Yeah, that's actually like, that's the style. Like Toth is one of, for me, one of the 2 or 3 top artists of all time. I prefer that sort of graphic style to the more detailed stuff like a Neil Adams and his influence, all the sketchiness and all the detail. I think it makes it much harder to cartoon to tell the story. And so like
Yeah.
really respond to the simpler, like clean cartooning, you know, like cartooning.
Yeah. Have you heard Paul Fricke, who's an artist? He did The Fly when DC did Impact, which was the Archie comics. But he just started a podcast on Alex Toth. There's 2
Okay.
episodes out now. And, you know, he's the first one's just kind of overview of who Toth was. And then the second one was just 10 great stories to start with. And it's, you know, and he's going to do like deep dives and analysis. I guess there's video versions as well, but it's really well done.
I'll have to check that out. Somewhere here I've got this gigantic, oversized Toth, like giant book. I guess there's like 2 or 3 of them, but I've got one of them.
Yeah.
Every time I see his work, it's just tremendous.
Yeah, I know. I picked up, I think it was called like Clinton Mac. I saw it at a antique store. It was like one of the serials that ran on the Mickey Mouse Club, but, you know, he did the artwork for the comic adaptation. And it's just, you know, and again, that's what they talk about in the podcast. A lot of times the stories are just, yeah, but, you know, the artwork just knocks it out of the park most of the time.
He did a fair amount of romance work. Sometimes the inking he doesn't do his own inking on some of those, so it's not quite,
yeah.
You know, it's like I've got one romance story where he did the pencils and Vince Colletta does the inks, so it's not exactly the match you want. But some of them it's tremendous. It's just I just love his design aesthetic.
Yeah.
All right, so I think we're at the end, number 10.
We're at the end, and this is just kind of random, but I wanted to represent, for a while there, a friend of mine at a bookstore, J&J Books on Lake Avenue in Rochester. I'd go in there and, you know, he'd buy collections and he'd have all different stuff in there. But I went in there once and saw this Hollywodland by Kim Deitch. And I had known Deitch for years, you know, his work, that is, and was signed, which was nice. But I had never read like a long form, and this was actually a series of, you know, half-page strips that were done in an alternative newspaper. But it's, you know, it's a fairly long story, and, you know, again, while I'd seen maybe 8-10-page stories by him, something this where he's really creating the world and you're diving in and it's just anything goes. You know, even though I'd known his work for 20 years, he just shot to the top of, like, you know, one of my favorite cartoonists, you know, from that point on. So, you know, he's probably with maybe Dan Close, the artist where as soon as he puts something out, pick it up right away. It's just amazing stuff. It's just, you never know what you're going to get into, because he always starts out like, well, this is what happened. I was talking to my brother or something, we were walking down the street, and then it just goes, and, what's real and what's not. And, again, I'm still not crazy about the way he draws, but, as a storyteller and a cartoonist and just the stories, it's just fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment you just made. Like, I feel like, the 90s get maligned for good reason, but one of the worst things that happened there is sort of the idea of this sort of style. And I think that's over substance. I feel like that's still carried on in a lot of mainstream stuff where a lot of people don't see the difference between the glossy, what it looks like, and then the storytelling. Some of those books in the 90s, even the ones with the cool art, they're unreadable because it's there's no storytelling. So like when you say there, you don't really love the way his art looks, but his drawing looks, but the art is good because the storytelling is good.
Yeah, in the 90s, it's the stuff that's like drawn, again, you could say Image, but there's plenty at Marvel and DC where it's, the drawing is just these totally out of proportion figures, and things just look like they're slapped on the page. And then this meticulous inking on it that doesn't make it look better. It's just this, why are you inking this thing so well instead of fixing it? Why are you just inking it?
Like, to me, some of the most unreadable comics maybe ever made, it's a little hyperbole, but maybe not, are the first few issues of the Jim Lee X-Men series, when they, because he would draw these like 2-page spreads where it's just like a 2-page of everyone standing, and then there would be Chris Claremont with like 400 word balloons where he's trying to describe in the word balloons what the action is, because there's no actual action on the page, it's everyone standing there. So we have to move the plot forward from one word balloon to the next in the dialogue because there's no movement in the artwork. And I feel like sometimes when I read new comics from the big two, I feel like that's still happening where, there's all these like poses, and I hate the deconstructed widescreen storytelling where they're trying to emulate a movie, because it's just like splash pages where it's just pinups and there's no storytelling, there's no flow, there's no comic book, it's.
Yeah. And now again, I don't pick things up, but I see stuff on the internet and I'll at least do it. And the drawing is better. I mean, there's a lot more realistic drawing, but it just doesn't have the movement or flow. And it's like watching TV sometimes. It's just pictures of people talking, and it misses some kind of dynamism where, if in ECs, where a lot of times it's just people talking, seems to be some kind of sense of movement and drama in there. But,
yeah, I just did a video the other day where I was talking about Mike Sikowski and how he's a bit of an acquired taste because he's not concerned with making his characters look good. He's concerned with imbuing them with energy. So his drawings, for me, they have all this energy, and sometimes they're almost intentionally ugly because the characters are so
those big barrel-chested.
It just moves. It it's movement the whole time, and so I'd much rather have that than something that's really well drawn, but there's no life in it,
Yeah. One of my favorite periods is kind of that silver bronze cusp at DC where I kind of had the end of Bob Hope and Jerry Lewis had Inferior 5, and you had people like Sikowski and Oxner, and you had Sparling doing things where it's just kind of, it doesn't look like comic book art quite as much anymore, but there's, like I said, there's an energy and movement to it, and there's some humor, and trying to be fun. I think when Adams had such an influence that everyone trying to make things real, and it doesn't always work with superheroes. I don't think Kirby was like, it wasn't real, but it was the truth, I guess, is what you could say. It's like, here's the character, here's the motion, here's the action, and I'm just going to portray that without trying to make it look like what it might look like in real life.
Yeah. All right. Well, I really appreciate you joining me. Really enjoyed this, and thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Origins, it's where we come from, it's where we've been. Everyone's got one.